I don't want to like totally change the subject, but like, when's the last time you heard anybody say, oh, he's a working dad? Like people always say like, oh, well, she's a working mom. She's probably going to have to leave at 5 and then be back online later.
If I could coach my younger self, I think it would be to just be all in at that moment in time, and showing up for my family with my whole self.
In fact, we had a joke. I said, what would you do differently looking back in your life? And he said, I would have worked more. So, I mean, that's a pretty extreme.
Welcome to the Executive Connect podcast. Today, we're going to talk about being a mother and an executive leader. I have my 3 friends, Jenny, Mel, and Michelle, to share some of their stories and insights about being an executive and a leader. Welcome, ladies. Jenny, I want to start with you. For you to share with our guests today a little bit about your journey as a mother, executive, and leader.
So I started having children when I was in my mid-30s until my early 40s. And by then, in my mid-30s, I was already working in-house for John Deere for several years. And so at that point, I had this established career. I had a structure that really worked well for starting my journey as a mother.
Given that you've had that big changes from 30s to 40s, Michelle, can you share a little bit about how you were able to balance motherhood and responsibilities as an executive?
Sure. Well, similar to Jenny, I was in my 30s when I met my now husband. And so I was already a young executive. So that kind of came first in my life. And I was very upfront about how I felt about my career and the important role it took for fulfilling my life. So when we started speaking about marriage and the idea of children, it was a point that we decided he would be the stay-at-home dad should we go down that route. So once we moved away from our family, my son was only 8 and my daughter was 4, and my husband began that chapter of his career as a stay-at-home dad. So without him and without that support for me personally, I would have had a really difficult time doing it. So I'm very fortunate that way.
Absolutely. Support is key to juggling work and life. Melody, want to talk a little bit about how you're able to juggle your children and your demanding job, traveling. So what are some challenges you have had to face in a role as an executive and a mother while traveling for your job?
Well, first of all, I started my motherhood journey a lot earlier. I had my first child at 25. So, I didn't really have a lot of choices at that age. You don't really get to kind of call the shots when you're really starting out in that kind of role. But I think to answer your question, it's a lot of guilt, honestly. It's a lot of support around me, but there's definitely times of just sort of managing that guilt, but also kind of my children seeing the things that I get to do. And, just recently I went to Dubai and my kids were like, that is so cool, and I really want to be an example for them, both the boys and the girls, of like, these are the things that you can do. And I also want them to see, like, you want a nice life, this is what it takes, And so they see me working hard. And yes, there is that guilt sometimes. Sometimes I miss things because I'm traveling. But I think that they see the trade-off, and I try to be really present when I am here so that it's not like just like, oh, mom's working all the time. I mean, believe me, there are some times like that. This past weekend was one of them. But it is a trade-off for them and for me. And, it's a little bit of give and take, I think.
I love that. I think you made a really good nugget there, is hard work, and to be a role model for our kids and to teach them what it takes to get where they need to go. So like you mentioned, hard work is key, and there's balances, and sometimes you're going to miss things and sometimes you're going to be there for things, but no matter what, you're always there for them. And I think that says a lot about you as a mother and a leader. And so kind of pivoting a little bit, Jenny, I want to talk a little bit about, I know John Deere is a big company. There's lots of big decisions that happen at large companies. How do you approach decision-making and problem solving in your home versus the workplace?
That's a really good question. So I was at John Deere for most of the time when I was having children. I left during COVID. Now I'm at a global tech firm that's quite a bit smaller, but my travel schedule has continued to be pretty intense, like Melody. So there's a domestic travel, there's a lot of international travel, but I've been doing that since they were born. And I think that in terms of decision making, I think travel is one of those areas where you have to think about what your intention is in terms of being home, being present, versus when you really need to make that trip, because some of these trips are technically, optional. Like it's a good thing to do. You may even feel needed there. But lately I've been thinking about how it's important to sit down and go through and put the family time on the calendar, make sure that the things that we need to do in terms of family vacations are on there first. And then how do I prioritize what I need to do for work? And I got this idea when I saw some Instagram ad. I love buying things off Instagram. I'm going to do like a whole podcast just on what, how I live my life, because Instagram shows me all the cool things that I can do and improve my life with. But one of them is called the Big Ass Calendar, and it fills the wall, and it has, okay, Michelle, it has like 365 days. And so I got that right off the bat in December for this year, and I put it up. It's on over here by my dining room table, and the kids are fascinated by this. And this is a way that I was able to be very intentional this year about trips and go in and make sure like the kids' birthdays are on there. When we're going to start planning the kids' birthdays are on there, everything that, soccer games and whatnot, so that, I can be more thoughtful about travel for work. So I think you're asking about like decision making. I think that itself, in terms of what do I know, what I've learned from work, and how does that translate at home? I think that when you're in a law firm, like I was before I went in-house to John Deere, people are coming to you for advice, and you're billing by the hour. And so it's very transactional, and people want that advice. And when you're in-house, you're just there, and people are not always coming to you for the advice. You're in a role where you're working side by side with the business, and you're being proactive about coming to them, and you're saying, hey, I saw something, and this is what I think you should be considering. Here's how I think it might inform what actions you take or your timeline. And you're telling them the impact. And so what I've learned is that decision making in larger organizations versus, a typical law firm client relationship it's very diffuse. And there's not a lot of like direct push the button, make it happen in a large organization or even a small organization. And so you have to learn that you don't tell people what to do and they just do it. That you have to come about decisions in a much more indirect way. And there's a book I love, it's called Obliquity. And it talks about most things happen in an oblique way. And that, I think, translates a lot at home too, where you think, because you have this authority figure as a parent, and you may be very authoritative as a person, that children are going to say, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to do that. Right. And then getting them where they need to be often happens in a very indirect way. So I think the idea that you you expect all this, how much mental energy and emotional energy it's going to take, both at work, doing that all day, and then go, and Michelle, you may have some comments on this. It's just not something that I realize. And I think sometimes I have to stop and own that, okay, I'm tired, because this is so much harder than I thought it would ever be. And it's, again, same, being home and running a household. Before you have children and you make all these decisions rather independently. And now that's just not the case. Things don't get done independently at all.
I was just going to give Jenny kudos, because my life is so different than having everything planned on a calendar and up on a wall. That was my nirvana state years and years ago before kids. But I am much more of the moment, of the week, of the hour. And I don't necessarily choose to be that way. It's just what life has taught me the last couple of years. Been thrown lots of curveballs, and I just have to pick myself up and kind of figure out, okay, how are we going to get through this week, or how are we going to get through this day? So love that you can start planning on when you plan the birthdays. I love that. But unfortunately, I'm not able to be like that at all. So kudos to you, Jenny.
I'm not saying I follow it. So in fact, I'm late planning my one son's birthday. So you just reminded me, I got to send some text messages.
The effort is there, though. Something you said, and I kind of started to laugh, and I wasn't laughing at you. I was actually thinking of something that happened with my son, because you were saying, what you do at work it sometimes doesn't necessarily translate to what you do at home. And I'm an analyst, and so a lot of times I may overthink things, and I'm trying to solve for things, and the kids may come to me and all they want is for me to listen, but I want to fix, or I want to, give them my insights. And my son was talking to me about something, and I was giving him kind of my advice, and he was like, "Mom, stick to being a tech analyst." I was like, okay. And it was actually something about nutrition, because he's a baseball player and whatever. And it turns out, 3 months later, he came back to me and he was like, "Coach wants me to eat 3 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches a week or a day." And I was like, "That's exactly what I told you." He doesn't want me to be right, but he's like, "Stick to doing what you do. Don't bring that home with you."
Yeah, that's all great points. I think a lot of times I get asked as a mom, how do you prioritize self-care? And I know a lot of times women ask me, do I have any tips on how I prioritize my own health, as well as the health of my children, as well as the health of my team? So I think just for everyone, maybe one at a time, do you have any self-care tips and tricks or habits that you incorporate into your day-to-day, week-to-week, that you could share with our listeners that help you stay, at your best, resilient, at your peak? Anyone want to go first? Michelle, you want to go first? All right.
I will say I'm not the best at that, and that's okay. I give myself grace. I kind of, do New Year's resolutions, I feel like, every month of what I'm going to do better. For me, it's looking forward to a beach vacation of just sitting in the sand, even if it's just for a few days, and having a glass of wine and tuning the world out. So that's my repair, and I am good now about listening to my body and when I need that, and giving myself permission to do that.
So scheduling it is key, and being mindful of how your body is telling you it's time. I've been working really hard. It's time to take a break. So I love that. Mel, any other, from your perspective, any tips for the listeners?
I go through cycles where sometimes I'm just really on it. I definitely prioritize like exercise, eating right, doing all the things. I'm addicted to my Whoop, which tells me my sleep and all the things. And so I do pay attention to that. And so if I see that like my recovery is low, I'm like, I'm just going to say no to a few more things. I've gotten better at saying no to things where I know that like it's because I have the data. I'm like, I'm not going out this weekend, or I'm not having that second glass of wine, or I'm going to sleep in a little bit tomorrow, because I know that I'm useless if I don't. And if I don't feel well, I'm not a good mom. I'm not good at work. I'm not good at anything. So sometimes that's a really hard thing to do because, then I feel stressed because I'm behind, or I've, let somebody down because I didn't show up to something or whatever. But sometimes you just have to do it. But like I said, sometimes I go in cycles where like I'm on it and I wake up and I make my bed and then I go and I do the greens shake and then I go for a walk. And then some days I'm like, none of it. So I think Michelle had a really good point of you just have to give yourself grace and do the best you can some days.
Yep, absolutely. Jenny, any thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. My mom was always busy. She was taking care of a lot of sick people when I was growing up, almost like a single parent. My dad worked a lot, and I never saw her stop and take care of herself. She dressed well, and she took care of herself in those kinds of ways. That was important in the culture that I was raised in. But in terms of mental and emotional health, I feel like she definitely sacrificed that. And in fact, after I had my fourth child, she passed away from a rare form of dementia that affects your executive functioning. And so it was almost like for those years when she was diagnosed leading up to her passing, she was forced to let other people take care of her and move from being the matriarch and caregiver to being, almost like a taken care of. So that was a big wake up call for me. I don't know that I would have really prioritized self-care until that point. And I realized that I had to figure it out for myself. I got really into Atomic Habits, like a lot of people. And it really made sense to me. And starting from a place of who do I want to be? And what is my identity? And then building and stacking habits around it. So I'm working on creating kind of an evening ritual habit, but I have my morning one down where when everyone's asleep, and I do like to go to bed early. So that's really key, is I've always liked to go to bed early, but waking up early, and that is my time. And I do like little things. I do a meditation from the Chopra app every morning. It's 10 minutes. If I don't do it, things go off track very quickly for me. And I do reading random pages out of a book. I do writing. Sometimes I jump on planning my day. But that is the big thing. And then I've stumbled into a lot of other like forms of self-care after the fact and realized, hey, so I took a vacation last year. I went to Greece with a couple of friends. It's the first time I'd taken a vacation independent of a work trip, maybe ever. And just being there in that environment, some of it was the culture of, like not everything's perfect, but that's okay. Right. And just being friendly and laid back and truly having a relaxing vacation that I didn't overschedule, that I didn't try to tack on, some other, stressful work event. It was kind of stumbling into like, I need to do this, like what Michelle was saying. I need to recognize the signs of when I just need that time where I have no demands on me from anyone else, and I just can be a human being. So I still working on that piece of it, of recognizing what is the right cadence and what form does that take? Because it is so personal to each of us. It depends on our family, depends on our job. But I do think it's hard because whereas I see my 14-year-old daughter, it's not self-care. It's just life. It's expected. They've already learned, this next generation, that this is critical. This isn't like being selfish. This isn't superfluous. It's just critical that they have to prioritize themselves. And I'm so proud to see that that's the new normal, right? It gives me a lot of hope in this generation, because I feel like my parents' generation, I don't know if you agree, it was seen completely the opposite, that it was selfish, that you were, hurting your family. I mean, we talk about, have we come far enough, but that's a pretty big change in a generation or so. What do y'all think about that?
I find that interesting because I still see leaders who criticize, like, not necessarily our generation, but maybe, like the 20 somethings for being selfish because they don't answer their emails after 6 or 5 for that matter. I have a daughter who's 26 and she's, she worries about stuff like that. Like, she's like, if you're not on 24/7, are people going to be upset? Because there are still people who think that if you're not working all the time, the way I think most of us did, it's going to be looked at as you're lazy, or if you do draw those boundaries, that it's, you might get passed up by the person who's willing to work harder. I mean, especially you come from a legal background, it's hours you put in. I mean, there is still like some places where that's the norm. I actually recently had dinner with a woman who worked for me several years ago, and I sometimes fear that I like damaged all the people who worked for me, because I would send them emails at like 2:00 in the morning, not because I wanted them to work at 2:00 in the morning, but just because that's what worked for me, because I would go home and take care of my children, and then I would go back to work. And she is just incredible at managing her time and her 2 children, and has these great boundaries and has figured out this like incredible life for herself. And I was so proud of her for doing that, because I don't know that I modeled that for her that well. And I do think that this generation is really good at drawing those boundaries, but I think that leadership also has to be accepting of it. And not all leadership is. And I think as women, as moms, and also men need to pay attention to it too, and be like, yeah, I need to make that happen for them, which I don't want to like totally change the subject, but like, when's the last time you heard anybody say, oh, he's a working dad? Like, people always say like, oh, well, she's a working mom, she's probably gonna have to leave at 5 and then be back online later. Nobody ever calls like working dads. Like, my husband never says like, well, I'm a working dad, so I might, be offline from 5 to 7 and then I'll see you guys back on at 8, Like, why are we working moms, but they're not working dads?
Or that they feel guilty about taking a meeting at night or going on a trip. I mean, I never experienced that. And never once, and often I was the lone woman traveling with a lot of dudes, and never, some of them be like, yeah, I just don't call home when I'm traveling, and everybody like just gets that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very fortunate. My boss's wife works, and so he's super understanding of what it takes to raise a family and have a job, but not all people have that benefit.
I think you made a really good point, Mel, is how you integrate. Like, I like the word integrate. Everybody always asks me, work-life balance. Like, I travel for work. That week I'm off balance family-wise. I'm back, I'm home, I'm more balanced on the family side. And I think you made a really good point is, you had things to take care of after 5, you get back on in the evening, and that's what works for you. And I think one thing that you pointed out is sharing that with your staff, saying, hey, like, because I send you an email at 2:00 in the morning, I don't expect you to reply. I need to get it off my mind and down the road, because that's how I work. And I think, you all kind of touched on it a bit. I think the world, it has shifted a lot. I would totally agree. The jobs have shifted. People are more vocal about, I want to work from home. I need to leave at 5 to get my kids. And I would say, like Jenny, you mentioned, like my parents were exactly that. They worked hard. They put themselves aside. And if and when they had time, then they would do stuff for them. And, my sibling and I were very busy kids. And so they didn't have a ton of time, right? Because they were carting us here and carting us there. And so I guess another question for all three of you, for, women that are aspiring to be managers, leaders, executives, and they have children, what advice would each of you share with them on kind of that ride up in their career, that maybe something you didn't do or something you wish you would have done in the past? Michelle, you want to go first?
Sure. Earlier in my career, when I was a young mom, I thought that as long as I was sitting on the playroom floor and, interacting with them with my laptop on my lap and still writing emails and editing documents, etc., that counted. And that was like, oh, wow, look at me. I'm multitasking. I'm able to do both things. But I actually find as my children get older that they're calling me out on that, and they'd rather have me be all in and present with them for 10 minutes sitting at the dinner table, or playing a card game, and then to go into my office or wherever it is and have that final time getting my work done. So if I could coach my younger self, I think it would be to just be all in at that moment in time, and showing up for my family with my whole self and not trying to do it all at the same time.
1,000%, Michelle. It's that 5 or 10 minutes of focused time. And I didn't know that right off the bat. I actually had a therapist say, it really isn't like you have to take them to the park or Disneyland, or Starbucks. I do these little mommy missions, secret mommy missions, and they're not supposed to tell each other what we do, and they all do immediately, and it creates a lot of drama. But I'll take them, with me to Starbucks, and we'll, chat, and then maybe read a book or something. And they get just one-on-one time, but it doesn't even have to be that big of an event. It could just be 5 minutes. And I think that what I would say is along the lines of what you're saying, Michelle, that I wish I would have owned it sooner, and in a very more realistic way. I was talking to my dad. I was talking about the guilt that I felt that my oldest child, who was young at that point, was growing up, and I wasn't around because I was traveling so much for my job. And he said, nobody told you that you wouldn't have to sacrifice. It's like, he was working 360 days a year. And so for him, it was like, this is what I'm going to do. I am not going to apologize for it. And he's been very successful as a result of his discipline. And who told you that you wouldn't have this sacrifice? In fact, we had a joke. I said, what would you do differently looking back in your life? And he said, I would have worked more. So, that's a pretty extreme situation, but it's funny because we had that conversation, and I went down, I remember distinctly going on the showroom floor. If you've ever been to the John Deere headquarters, it's an incredible space. And it has this like multi-story showroom when you walk in, and they bring in equipment from different, decades and sizes. And there was a reception there, and some of the vice presidents were milling around. And I started talking to one of them in a group, and he said, the thing is like you tell yourself, oh, I would be CEO someday. I would want to do that. I could do that. He's like, but as I get older, I realize, one, I might not even be capable of that. Would I want to travel 300 days out of the year? Right. And with the kids that I have, and I was just like, light bulbs were going off. I was like, wow, like here's a guy who's very like a vice president, and there's like two of them, it's a very small group of people at this company. And he's sharing that he realizes that this isn't his journey and that he wouldn't be prepared to sacrifice given the ages of his kids and his family structure. And that it's a realistic look. And I've had younger people say, well, I want to have this position, I want to have that position. It goes back to, is the next generation really prepared for what you have to do and how much you have to work and the time you have to put in and how strategic you have to be to have a senior leadership position in a company? No, I don't think that anybody goes into it realistically and really owns what it takes and says, I am going to sacrifice and my kids are going to sacrifice for me to do this, but it's important and I'm going to do it. And then, let the chips fall where they may, and they're going to be consequences, but I'm going to own that. And I feel like that's something I wish I had done a little sooner in my career to realize that that's just the reality of the situation and that it's okay. And I don't have to apologize for it. And everybody in the family has bought into it, and that we're figuring out a way to make it work for us.
I love that. We have these family chats, and you mentioned just, the family has to be bought into that. Mom has to travel. How do you feel, about that? And if there's resistance, I know in my house, there is resistance with my travel schedule. And so a lot of times what I have done, and I love the new technology these days, like FaceTime wasn't around when my parents were parenting. So if my parents were gone, they were gone, and it was a phone call. And now when there is resistance, I'm able to FaceTime the kids and talk to them about their school day. And so there's still that touch, although I'm not in front of them or touching them. I am talking to them about their day. I am engaging them. My 2-year-old, he is more hesitant to get on FaceTime. He's irritated. So I've had to, not video with him, but talk to him. And so there's ways, right? There's ways to juggle it that works for the family. But like you mentioned, Jenny, getting everybody's buy-in and talking about it as a family, I think helps with some of those pressures in the house. Mel, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think like expecting more equality in the home is okay. And women have always just been taught to be the mom, be the caretaker, be the homemaker. We're supposed to be everything. And it's okay to say, we need to share responsibilities in this home. And that doesn't mean like, I want you to vacuum or I want you to do one specific thing. It's just, we need to share responsibilities, and that includes the children. And it shouldn't all fall on the mom always. There are times when our kids just want mom, and that's just biological. It's just a fact. It's just, and same, we want, to be there for them. But I am seeing a shift in the way that families engage with each other in kind of this next generation, where husbands are more involved in the home, in cooking dinner, and helping out more. I just think it's okay to expect that. And the relationships that, from what I've seen from the women who've reported to me over the years who do expect that from their relationships, those relationships tend to be a lot healthier than the ones where it isn't equal and there's resentment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. I think that's another really great point is asking for help too. A lot of times as women, we are not good at saying we need help in this area, work or home. And we take on this giant burden and then get irritable with our managers, our spouses, our partners. And so I absolutely agree. I think it's asking for help and then letting somebody help. I know myself, a lot of times with my husband, I have to, the way I do it is very different than the way he folds things. And so my version of a folded towel could be very different than his in a ball towel put away, right? But I think it's like, let it go. Is it worth, it's folded, it's his way, it's put away. Yeah. It's also to let others help and then let them do the way that it works for them. Is difficult sometimes, right?
Yeah, but also, letting the kids have some responsibility. And, that's always been a struggle for me because I'm not a helicopter mom, but I think maybe it's part of it that I am gone a lot. I want to be the mom when I'm home. And so I will do stuff like do their laundry and pick up their things. And, I want to like do those mom things when I am home. And but like, then I'm like, what am I doing? Actually, one of my girlfriends was like, you're not raising good husbands if you're doing all that for them. Like, teach them to pick up their own stuff because she has 3 girls and she's like, my girls don't want to marry someone who's used to having their mommy pick up after them. And I was like, ooh, good point. Okay. So now I'm like, you take out the trash, you make your bed, you put away the towels, like I want them to be trained to be good husbands who participate in their portion of the household.
Isn't that so much harder to work with them, to teach them to do it themselves? I mean, at least at work, you can assign a task, you can delegate, and maybe they won't do it or they won't do it right away, but they'll pretend like they'll accept that. And with kids, it's like, no. It's for me, it's an issue of energy management. There's a great leader in the space, Erin Reeves, who talks about this. I saw a keynote in the fall and she talked about, it's really hard because as women, our no's are not accepted the same way that other people's are. And so you have this like equation in your head of how much energy am I going to spend trying to get, either just do it myself or get someone to do it, a child or, somebody at work. And you're making that calculation. And then sometimes it's just easier and less energy just to do it. So that's hard to resist that allure of just doing it. And then you do it the way that you want to do it. So I don't know if you have any advice about that.
No, I think that's a really good point. I love that you brought that up, Mel, because in our house, everybody is assigned a job, a duty, and that is their job and their duty. And I think the one thing is initially there's resistance, why do we have to do this? And why do we have to do that? But they're learning to take care of themselves. So as girls, they're learning how to do things that they didn't know, to take care of themselves, to share in responsibility. And I think the other side of it, as they get older and they go to the workforce, somebody's not going to do their job or do their laundry or take out their trash. They're going to have to learn how to, do these tasks. So if it's trained now into them and it's ingrained into them, and we can guide them along this journey of how they do things, they become, like you mentioned, better husbands, better wives, better employees, and they're making mistakes in the comfort of our home. And we're able to guide them and teach them here because, I have heard through the pandemic, a lot of friends of mine, children have come home during the pandemic. They weren't able to take care of themselves, so they moved back into the house for different reasons. But when you teach them how to take care and take responsibility young, it becomes second nature as they get older. Mm-hmm. So I love that you brought that up. Michelle, any other thoughts?
Just playing off of what Jenny said, I think that in my heart of hearts, and you probably feel the same way, we know that we do it the best. Nobody could do it as good as we can. However, we can't strive for perfectionism. We have to somewhat lower the bar, and we have to, challenge ourselves to let others help. And I think that's true. of both in the workforce and at home.
I love it. So just kind of one closing question for everyone, just looking ahead for the future for women, moms, leaders, maybe each of your perspectives about, your hopes for other moms and women in the future, either personally or professionally. Melody, you want to go first?
Sure. I have to think for a second, but yeah. Well, Michelle, you said you had something.
Yeah, go ahead,
I'll
Michelle.
let you go first because I have to think that through a little bit.
Sure. I would say go for it. Try to have it all. Enjoy the journey. Don't give up. Be patient. Be positive. I think that when we were speaking about self-care, I think that one thing I was thinking about and that I encourage people to do is really take time each day, each week to give gratitude for all the things that you do have and how fortunate we are to, have our health or have income or have a roof over our heads, food on the table, etc. When you put it in the grand context of everything going on, we are very fortunate and we should be very grateful. And it kind of helps just put things in perspective for me. So I'd say young moms, keep that in mind, but, go for it.
Yeah, Jenny, you want to go next?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I think just really like kind of whether you want to be a mom or you don't. And I think people can make that choice. Just kind of setting that intention for your life and being okay with where you want to go and deciding your path, not letting society or your parents or anybody else decide your path, really kind of setting exactly your intention for what you want your partner to be, what you want your life to be like, what you want your job to be like, how you want your days to feel, and going after that. And whether it's how society thinks you should be or how you think you should be or what feels right for you, I think just really kind of setting that for yourself and following that path is what I would say to any woman going into workforce, motherhood, not motherhood, partnership, whatever that looks like for you. That's what I would want for any young woman today.
Jenny, any?
I have two thoughts. I have one that's kind of practical in nature, and then I have more of like a macro. The practical advice I would have is to figure out as quickly as you can what works for you, not just what advice people have that work for them, but what works for you, and then automate as much as you can of that. So for example, when you figure out when you are in the best place in the day to do your most difficult work, right? If you're a morning person, then you've got to put boundaries around that time and do that work. And then when you know you have energy dips in the afternoon, then you block that time for scheduling meetings or doing, low complexity tasks. And so it's about what works for you and then just automating it. I have certain blocks in the day, knowing where my energy levels are and how to utilize that most effectively. I can be a lot more productive owning my schedule than I can and just letting people fill it up with back-to-back meetings. And there are days that I do the back-to-back meetings and there's a record. Apparently people try to break sometimes of we're going to have 14 meetings today. So you can't always do it, but you got to do it enough. So you kind of protect, again, yourself. That's a form of self-care, right? And then automating it so that you're not, trying to do this ad hoc every day. I think the macro advice is something I learned in mediation, actually, and it works better in terms of parenting and it works better in the workplace, no matter what level you're at. And that's just going with more of an improvisational yes and instead of in part of it is the job, right? As an attorney, like you're looking for problems, you're spotting issues, and you can really fall in love with the problem and talk a lot about what not to do. But in an improvisation, that's much more realistic about life and work, right? You don't get to like, segment everything out and say, this is going to be an issue and do this and do that. It's more of making sure that you're going with the flow with the business or with your kids. It's like, yes, that's going on. Yes, that's what you want to do. And let's incorporate this, cut a safeguard, or let's do that. Yes, let's do that at, 7 p.m. or do that tomorrow for dinner. It's trying to go with the flow and be improvisational and enjoy that ride rather than, okay, this is exactly how everything is going to work and I can balance motherhood and work and this is how it's all going to, this is how it's going to play out.
Yeah, giving yourself grace, right? Like just grace in the process. We're all having kids at different ages. The older we get, the more we know. When you have kids younger, you got to kind of make some mistakes along the way. And, in my 40s now, I'm like, gosh, I would have never done that in my 20s or managed, kids that way. So I think giving yourself grace and realize there's no right way to be a leader and there's no right way to be a mom. We're all just doing our best and working hard at whatever our passions are. And sometimes we got to lean into being a better parent for a period of time and lean into being a better employee. But I think the older we get, the more tools we have in our toolbox. And, I think the one thing I've learned is just being a little bit vulnerable and telling people my kid's home sick. I'm going to have to juggle it. But I'm here. And I think the more that you're vulnerable as a leader at the right times, right, when you can be, the more people will meet you there and say, oh, I get it. No problem. I've had a sick kid before. I get what you're going through. So I think just learning to be more vulnerable versus, a lot of times the stigma that, if you're a mom and an executive, that you're not going to be as good of an executive because you have home responsibilities. And I think, I can't remember who said it. I think the minute that I became a mom, I felt like I became, a better leader, a better employee, because I had more constraints on my time. I had to really get focused. And Jenny, I'm definitely getting that calendar. I love this calendar idea. I need to be on Instagram more. But I think, I think Brene Brown says it, right? Being vulnerable. She talks a lot about it, but vulnerability with boundaries, right? I think a lot of times I've been vulnerable when I shouldn't have. And looking back, I probably needed to think about it before I was vulnerable. Does anybody have any other closing thoughts before we close, or things that they want to share with our listeners? First of all, thank you three for being here. I love that you shared your time with our listeners and your experiences. Connect with these ladies. They're executives, they're moms, they do all the things. They have great tips and tricks. So thank you three for being here today. And that's the Executive Connect podcast.